Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. This isn't the kind of neighborhood where people go missing or get buried beneath rose bushes. Just outside Houston, Texas, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, the Wright family home didn't raise eyebrows. The lawn was neat, the curtains drawn, and the Christmas decorations still lingered in the January air. There was no immediate reason for alarm. No loud arguments, no broken windows, no flashing sirens. But 5 days after Jeff Wright was last seen alive, a Houston criminal defense attorney received a trembling call from his client, 26-year-old Susan Wright. "I need help. I did something. I think I killed my husband." It wasn't a 911 call. It wasn't even reported to police. It was a confidential statement, filtered through a lawyer, about a death that hadn't been reported, a body that hadn't been found, and a crime scene that had been sanitized. By the time authorities arrived at the Wright residence on January 18, 2003, Susan was already sitting with her legal representation, the front door open to a house that, on the surface, seemed untouched by violence. But experienced officers understood that sometimes the quietest rooms carry the loudest evidence. In the backyard, just steps from the patio, investigators were directed to a flower bed that didn't quite belong. The soil was freshly turned. A pair of rose bushes had been hastily replanted. The ground still held a dampness uncharacteristic for a dry Texas winter. Inside, crime scene technicians noted the unmistakable scent of industrial bleach in the master bedroom. The mattress was missing. The baseboard trim had been repainted. The carpet looked new. These weren't the random upgrades of a homemaker. They were efforts, coordinated or desperate, to erase something. Susan Wright, a stay-at-home mother of two, stated through her attorney that she had acted in self-defense, that Jeff had abused her for years, that on the night of January 13th, a routine argument escalated into violence, that she snapped. But what investigators were about to uncover wouldn't align so easily with spontaneous rage. The forensic team uncovered a body wrapped in bedsheets. The male victim, later identified by dental records as 34-year-old Jeff Wright, was found in a shallow grave. He had been stabbed repeatedly, not once, not twice, not even dozens of times. The final count reached 193, 41 to the face, 23 to the neck, 46 to the chest, dozens more across the torso, arms, and back. Some of the wounds were shallow, others, deep and forceful, had fractured bone. One knife blade had snapped off inside his skull. The Harris County Medical Examiner's Office concluded that Jeff Wright had died of multiple sharp force injuries. The attack had lasted several minutes. Based on blood patterns later revealed in luminol testing, the assault occurred in the master bedroom. A trail of smeared blood was found leading out of the room, evidence that the body had been dragged post-mortem. At this stage, there were no public charges, no arrests, no media, just a backyard grave, a confession filtered through legal counsel, and a sanitized room that once served as the epicenter of a family's life. From a procedural standpoint, this case lacked the initial markers of typical domestic homicide. There was no active missing person report, no prior calls for domestic violence, no history of police intervention. Neighbors were surprised, but none had intervened in the past. They described the Wrights as private, even isolated. Inside the home, detectives documented inconsistencies between the confession and the scene. There were signs of premeditation, removal of evidence, purchase of new bedding, fresh paint. Still, without surveillance, digital communications, or a third-party eyewitness, the case leaned heavily on forensics and psychology. As the autopsy was completed and forensic teams combed through the home, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a matter of how Jeff Wright died. It was going to be a matter of why. Detectives began compiling a timeline. The last known sighting of Jeff was the night of January 13th. He'd returned home after dinner with Susan and their young son. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. The children were home. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, no struggle apparent in other parts of the house. But in a home where nothing was out of place, it was the order that raised suspicion. Detective Jimmy Dodson of Harris County would later reflect, "I've worked plenty of domestic violence cases, but this one, the cleanup told me more than the confession. The scene was too clean, too calculated. That doesn't happen in a panic. Over the next few weeks, investigators would dig deeper into the Wrights' marriage. They would look at Jeff's financial records, insurance policies, Susan's medical history, and digital correspondence. And while the prosecution prepared its case, the defense worked quietly in the background, crafting a narrative of long-term abuse and psychological collapse. What emerged wasn't just a murder, it was a conflict of perception. Was Susan Wright a cold-blooded killer, or the final survivor of unchecked abuse? But that debate would come later. For now, there was a shallow grave, a sanitized crime scene, and a timeline with gaps large enough to bury the truth. January 18, 2003. The backyard grave had been uncovered. The body had a name, Jeffrey Andrew Wright. The wounds spoke volumes, but they didn't explain the gap. Investigators now had a death. What they needed was a timeline. Who saw Jeff last? When? And what happened between January 13 and January 18? The first step was to determine the last confirmed sighting of the victim. Jeff Wright's employer, a local insurance agency, told investigators that he left work early on Monday, January 13th. According to his assistant, he'd said he was going home to spend time with his family. No red flags, no complaints, just a man going home. Susan Wright later confirmed to detectives that the family had dinner together that evening. Her, Jeff, and their 4-year-old son. She stated Jeff had been drinking and was agitated. After putting the children to bed, she said they argued. Her version of events ended with Jeff storming out of the house barefoot and without his wallet. But forensic review of Jeff's financial activity raised questions. There were no ATM withdrawals, no credit card charges, no cell phone pings from the night of January 13th onward. Not even idle location data. His phone went dark that night at 9:27 p.m., cut off mid-signal from the home's Wi-Fi router. Jeff's car was found still parked in the garage. His shoes remained by the bed. His keys were located in the kitchen drawer. The idea that he simply walked away from the home voluntarily didn't align with any of these facts. And when it came to physical exits, the front door showed no signs of forced entry or exit. The backyard gate was locked from the inside. Detectives turned to digital evidence. Jeff's work emails, accessed through his company-issued laptop, showed no signs of outgoing messages past January 13th. A partially drafted email to a client was left unsent. Timestamp 6:38 p.m., January 13th. The Wrights' home phone had no outgoing calls that night, no 911, no contact with friends or family, and Susan had not reported Jeff missing. There were no voicemails left for him, no flyers, no social media activity, only silence. Detective Jimmy Dodson noted during the early investigation that this level of inactivity wasn't just odd, it was statistically rare. When people vanish, someone usually starts asking questions, but Jeff vanished and it stayed quiet. That's not how families act. That's how someone covering something up acts. Neighbors were interviewed. None had seen Jeff after Monday evening. One neighbor recalled Susan walking their dog alone the next morning. Another mentioned seeing Susan moving large bags from the garage to the side yard around dusk on January 14th. It wasn't enough to prove a crime yet, but it supported the theory that Jeff didn't simply walk away. The Wright children were too young to provide clear testimony. The oldest, just 4 years old at the time, said he hadn't seen Daddy since Mommy told him to go. Statements from children that young are unreliable and legally inadmissible without corroboration. Still, the case was beginning to solidify. Jeff Wright was alive on January 13th. He had no known medical conditions, no signs of suicidal ideation, no financial problems, no flight risk indicators. And then he disappeared entirely within a space of 12 hours. On January 20th, the Harris County Sheriff's Office executed a full forensic sweep of the Wright residence, now secured as an active crime scene. Luminol testing revealed faint blood traces in the garage and along the hallway floorboards, suggesting a body had been moved. Drag patterns aligned with the estimated weight of the victim and the burial depth in the yard. Detectives requested home improvement store records from local vendors. One receipt, dated January 15th, matched Susan's credit card. Purchase: 1 gallon of primer, 1 gallon of bleach-based cleaner, and a new bed frame. The new mattress found in the bedroom, installed days after Jeff's death, was confirmed via delivery receipt from a local furniture store. The purchase had been made under Susan's name. When asked about the timing, Susan said she'd been meaning to redecorate. None of these elements were independently conclusive, but together they painted a pattern. Jeff went missing on the night of January 13th. He hadn't used his phone, his car, or his bank account since. His body was buried just feet from the bedroom where he was likely killed. The home had been altered within 48 hours of his death. No one had reported him missing. In criminal investigations, motive, means, and opportunity form the core triad. But before any of that, investigators ask one fundamental question: does the story make sense? And in this case, it didn't. The timeline was too tight, the silence too complete. One detective on the case would later comment, "The hardest part of this job isn't finding the truth. It's cutting through the lies dressed up as logic." As prosecutors began considering potential charges, the case shifted from forensic to psychological. The next phase would require separating trauma from strategy, reaction from preparation. That responsibility would fall to the analysts, the interrogators, and eventually the jury. The autopsy of Jeffrey Andrew Wright began on January 20th, 2003, 2 days after his body was exhumed from the shallow grave behind his home. The lead medical examiner from the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, Dr. Dwayne Wolfe, conducted the procedure. His report would later become the cornerstone of the case, not just because it confirmed how Jeff died, but because it helped determine how long it took and how much intent may have been involved. Jeff Wright suffered a total of 193 sharp force injuries. That figure wasn't speculative. Each wound was carefully documented, photographed, and measured. 41 were located on the face, 23 to the neck, 46 to the chest and torso. The remainder were scattered across his back, arms, and legs. Not all wounds were fatal. Many were superficial. Others were deep, forceful, and repeated. A few penetrated bone. At least 6 pierced vital organs. Among the more chilling findings, one of the knives had snapped during the attack, the blade fragment lodging inside Jeff's skull. Another wound showed hesitation marks, typically associated with chaotic overkill or emotional disorganization at the scene. Dr. Wolfe identified signs of defensive injuries on both forearms, suggesting Jeff had attempted to shield himself, at least in the early moments of the assault. The body exhibited no signs of restraint-induced trauma to the wrists or ankles, meaning any claim of being bound during the attack remained unsupported at that stage. This single detail would later be critical during both the investigation and eventual courtroom proceedings. Toxicology results returned no drugs or alcohol in Jeff's system. He was sober at the time of death. No signs of cardiac stress or prior medical emergencies were present. There were no skin abrasions or signs of sexual trauma. His time of death was placed between 9:30 p.m. and midnight on January 13th, consistent with the digital inactivity already confirmed by investigators. Back at the crime scene, forensic investigators focused on wound trajectory. The pattern indicated the victim was initially attacked from the front, with the majority of lethal wounds to the chest. Later wounds, particularly to the back and face, were consistent with a body either falling or already on the ground. This sequencing mattered. It disproved any narrative of a single reactive strike or accidental escalation. The volume and distribution of wounds implied sustained physical effort, extended duration, and a progression from frontal to prone assault. Investigators mapped the spatial dimensions of the bedroom, comparing them with blood pattern data previously captured under luminol. Drag marks visible beneath the carpet confirmed that the body had been relocated from bed to garage before being moved to the burial site. The pathology team also examined time-based clotting and blood saturation levels. Their conclusions aligned with a multi-minute attack, likely lasting between 4 and 6 minutes. That may not seem long, but in the context of a stabbing, it's nearly an eternity. In reviewing these findings, one senior forensic analyst noted, "The physical act of stabbing someone nearly 200 times requires more than anger. It requires focus. It requires time. And it almost always requires emotional detachment." Susan Wright's legal team at that point had already communicated her claim of self-defense. That narrative included a struggle, years of abuse, and a breakdown that culminated in one violent night. But none of that could yet be corroborated through medical evidence. Her body bore no bruises. Her medical records from prior years contained no formal reports of injury or trauma. She had not sought treatment or protection orders. That didn't mean abuse hadn't occurred, but from a legal standpoint, it meant the defense had no physical proof of it. While forensic teams documented knife wound characteristics, detectives worked with the Texas Department of Public Safety to compare the blade fragments recovered from Jeff's skull with knives seized from the Wright household. One of the kitchen knives, missing its tip, matched exactly. The handle showed signs of high-impact fracture. Meanwhile, crime scene photographs taken at the time of body recovery revealed that the grave had been deliberately layered. A sheet below the body, dirt packed tightly, with rose bushes placed above. This effort suggested premeditation or, at minimum, concealment, an element rarely present in cases where someone acts in the heat of fear or panic. Despite the mounting evidence, investigators held back from formal charges. They were constructing a sequence, not just gathering proof. A prosecutable case wouldn't rely on the body alone. It would require tying that body to motive, opportunity, and behavior in the days that followed. And Susan Wright's behavior after January 13th had already raised several red flags. She hadn't called police. She hadn't contacted Jeff's family. She hadn't acted like someone unsure if her husband was alive or dead. She had instead painted over a wall, replaced a mattress, and purchased patio plants. Some cases hinge on what you can prove, others on what you can't deny. In the autopsy suite, Jeff Wright's body told the only version of events it could. The wound map read like a timeline. It didn't reveal who had held the knife, but it made one thing unmistakably clear. Whoever did this had kept going long after it was necessary to stop. By the end of January 2003, the forensic groundwork had been laid. The body was identified. The wound map was complete. The timeline had narrowed to a single night. Now investigators turned their focus to everything that happened after that night. The behavior, choices, and movements inside the Wright household in the 5 days between Jeff's death and the discovery of his grave. The physical scene was already telling a story. Investigators knew a mattress had been replaced, a wall had been repainted, and the bedroom showed signs of deep cleaning. But they needed confirmation, records, receipts, timestamps, and they got them. On January 15th, 2 days after Jeff Wright was last known to be alive, a purchase was made at a local home improvement store. The transaction, charged to Susan Wright's credit card, included 1 gallon of primer, 1 gallon of bleach-based cleaner, a pack of paint rollers, and 2 rose bushes. The store's loyalty program confirmed her identity through a linked phone number. The receipt timestamped the sale at 10:26 a.m. A second transaction appeared later that same day. This one came from a furniture retailer less than 3 miles from the Wright residence. The purchase, a queen-size mattress, paid in full and scheduled for delivery the next morning. The old mattress, according to delivery records, had been left at the curb for disposal and was gone by 10:45 a.m. Inside the home, crime scene analysts noted that the baseboards near the bed had been coated in a fresh layer of white paint. Not just touched up, completely sealed. Chemical tests revealed that the original surface underneath had absorbed human blood, and the new coat had been applied without primer. The paint matched the brand listed on the receipt from January 15th. These were not accidental overlaps. They were patterns. The floor of the garage showed signs of mopping. The drain near the rear wall had been recently cleared, despite no plumbing work being scheduled. The trash bins outside the home were empty, collected without delay, and the bags could not be recovered. Neighbors, when questioned, recalled seeing Susan sweeping the garage floor and dragging what looked like a rolled carpet to the curb. In the kitchen, investigators found no signs of blood, no weapons, nothing that stood out. But the absence of anomalies was itself unusual, considering what had happened just steps away. Law enforcement subpoenaed Susan's bank and credit card activity for the full month of January. There were no large cash withdrawals, no signs of an attempt to flee, no hotel stays, no car rentals, no third-party communication suggesting panic or an attempt to report trauma. Her phone activity remained normal, limited to basic calls with her mother and sister. She hadn't contacted a therapist, a doctor, or law enforcement. One of the detectives on the case noted that in similar domestic homicides, there's usually a behavioral rupture, something that shows the suspect is unraveling under stress. But in this case, the behavioral footprint was clean. Too clean. The house was still in order. The children's schedule had not changed. Susan continued dropping her son off at preschool, returned home, and ran errands. No one reported erratic conduct. No one noticed anything out of sync, aside from Jeff's absence, which Susan had attributed to a fight and a temporary separation. But the problem wasn't what Susan did. It was what she didn't do. She didn't notify Jeff's family. She didn't check with his employer. She didn't file a missing persons report. She didn't ask anyone if they'd heard from him. To the outside world, she acted as though nothing had happened. Internally, she had rearranged the entire environment, mattress, paint, soil, and done so with transactional clarity. When questioned by investigators on January 20th, Susan reiterated her earlier statement. She had been in fear, that Jeff had hurt her in the past, that the night of January 13th he had flown into a rage, and she acted to protect herself. She claimed she couldn't recall how many times she had stabbed him. She said the cleanup was panic, the burial, desperation. But the receipts didn't reflect panic. They showed a calculated timeline. Cleaner first, then paint, then mattress. Garden supplies came last. There were no sudden cash withdrawals, no signs of someone planning to disappear. She had made the house livable again. That was the part investigators couldn't ignore. In the end, the prosecution wouldn't rely solely on her words. They'd present the paper trail, the silent but exact record of what happens when someone tries to bury the truth in drywall and flower beds. By the time detectives sat down with Susan Wright for a formal interview, they had already mapped out the scene, reconstructed the timeline, and reviewed the autopsy report. What they needed now wasn't evidence. It was explanation. Her confession had arrived through a lawyer. Now they wanted it on record, and they needed to hear how she would frame the night her husband died. Susan stated that the argument started over money. According to her, Jeff had been using cocaine again. He'd been irritable, unstable, and violent. She claimed he'd shoved her in front of their 4-year-old son. That night, she said, he dragged her into the bedroom, hit her, and then forced her onto the bed. In that moment, she feared for her life. She told investigators that in a panic, she grabbed a knife from the nightstand and didn't remember much after that. She insisted it was self-defense. She didn't intend to kill him, she said. She was afraid. Afraid for herself, for her children, for what he might do next. But the interview notes show a key inconsistency. There was no confirmed history of reported abuse. Not with police, not with medical staff, not with neighbors, family, or friends. No protection orders. No previous calls to 911. That didn't mean it never happened, but it left investigators without a foundation to weigh the credibility of her claims. The next problem came from the forensics. There was no blood spatter on the walls where she claimed the initial attack took place. The body had been moved, which didn't fit a scenario where someone fought off an attacker and immediately called for help. There were no signs of a struggle in other rooms, no overturned furniture, no injuries on Susan. Her account described a rapid assault, yet Jeff had 193 wounds. That alone created a gap no theory could easily bridge. Investigators didn't argue with her directly. They didn't need to. They cross-referenced her account with the physical evidence and documented every inconsistency. For example, Susan said she stabbed him near the edge of the bed while trying to get away. But luminol showed the heaviest concentration of blood near the center of the mattress, an area consistent with a prone, motionless target. Then came the question of cleanup. Susan said she panicked after the stabbing. She claimed she blacked out and only came to after seeing the blood. But by the following morning, she had begun cleaning the floor. She scheduled a mattress replacement. She purchased paint and bleach. She even covered the grave with flowers. That level of organization, investigators noted, takes intent. It takes time. It takes someone thinking clearly. Prosecutors reviewing the case emphasized that self-defense isn't just about fear. It's about immediacy, proportionality, a response to a threat that leaves no other option. And that wasn't what the physical evidence showed. Jeff's body wasn't left in the bedroom. It was wrapped in sheets, dragged through the garage, and buried in a pre-dug section of garden. The door was locked. The blinds were drawn, and for 5 days no one asked where he'd gone. Investigators considered whether a sudden trauma, built up over years, might push someone to the edge. But again, that only mattered if the facts supported it. And facts in criminal law are not shaped by feeling. They're shaped by documentation. Susan said she feared for her life, but her statements never included a phone call, a neighbor's knock, a doctor's visit, or a journal entry. Not a single third-party record placed Jeff in a pattern of physical violence toward her. And still, those who investigate crimes know that silence doesn't mean nothing happened. Abuse often hides in places no report ever reaches. But in this case, the investigators weren't just looking for signs of a fight. They were trying to answer a different question. If this was self-defense, why did the evidence look like a cover-up? By early February 2004, the Wright case had moved from forensic labs and interview rooms to the Harris County courtroom. The evidence was no longer just data. It was now part of a larger strategy. Prosecutors had one task: to convince a jury that what happened on January 13, 2003 wasn't a spontaneous act of self-defense, but a calculated homicide. Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler led the case. She wasn't known for subtlety. Her courtroom style was precise, aggressive, and built on a demonstrative evidence. In the Wright case, she decided to go beyond photographs and diagrams. She brought the actual bed into the courtroom. The wooden bed frame from the Wright's master bedroom had been preserved. Siegler used it as the foundation for her visual reconstruction of the crime. With a life-size mannequin, she recreated what the prosecution believed had happened: a restrained victim, lying on the bed, stabbed repeatedly by someone in complete control of the scene. The jurors didn't have to imagine it, they saw it. Alongside that, prosecutors presented forensic data in structured progression. First came the blood pattern analysis: extensive pooling on the mattress, clean separation from surrounding walls, no cast-off that would suggest movement. This supported a theory that Jeff Wright had been largely immobile during the majority of the attack. Next, wound mapping was layered in. The medical examiner testified to the sequence. Front-facing stab wounds were consistent with initial impact. Back and shoulder wounds came later, suggesting the victim had been repositioned or rolled. That sequence directly undermined the claim of chaotic defense. Prosecutors also outlined the defendant's post-crime behavior in a chronological timeline built from verified financial records. The timeline included the purchase of paint, bleach, garden tools, and a new mattress. Each item was connected with a date, a receipt, and a purpose. The prosecution's narrative was clear. This was not an outburst. This was organization. Not a fearful cover-up, but a cleanup plan executed over several days. In court, the defense tried to reframe that narrative. Susan's attorneys emphasized trauma, control, and long-term abuse. They suggested that silence on Susan's part didn't mean absence of abuse. It meant fear, cultural stigma, and psychological conditioning. But prosecutors were prepared. They brought in expert witnesses to speak on patterns of defensive wounds, stress response behavior, and the statistical rarity of spontaneous overkill in domestic defense situations. None of those analyses ruled out trauma, but they weakened the claim that trauma alone explained 193 stab wounds and days of concealment activity. The trial pivoted on two conflicting models: chaos versus control. The defense asked jurors to view the stabbing as the peak of years of suppression. The prosecution asked them to view it as a deliberate act with preparation, concealment, and method. There was no video, no direct witness, no surviving victim. What the jurors had was forensics, receipts, behavior, and the timeline. And in criminal court, those are often more durable than testimony. The prosecution concluded by showing the jury the exact garden trowel purchased to replant the rose bushes. It was standard, plastic-handled, available at any home improvement store. But in this case, it had been used to finish a burial. Sometimes the strongest evidence is the simplest object used with clear intent. As the prosecution closed its case, the weight of the physical evidence was clear. Forensic sequencing, body position analysis, and post-crime behavior all pointed toward intentional violence. But the trial wasn't over. The defense was now up, and they weren't building their argument on physical evidence. They were building it on history, on the invisible damage that doesn't show up under luminol or CT scan. Susan Wright's defense team began their presentation, by acknowledging the obvious. Susan had killed her husband. But what they wanted jurors to see was not how Jeff Wright died, but why Susan believed she had to do it. There was no physical record of past domestic violence, but the defense leaned into a known reality in family courts and trauma studies. Abuse often leaves no formal trail. What they offered instead were witnesses. Susan's friends, her family, and a psychologist, each describing subtle warning signs over years. Mood shifts, isolation, financial control. Statements Susan had made in confidence. Things that, when viewed individually, seem minor. But in context, they tried to suggest a sustained pattern of coercion and fear. Dr. Jerome Brown, a licensed forensic psychologist, testified that Susan showed clear indicators of long-term emotional abuse. He noted her passivity in interviews, her inability to recount events without gaps, her flattened emotional tone. He described what he called learned helplessness, a state where the abused becomes emotionally paralyzed, even after the abuser is no longer a threat. The defense did not argue against the number of stab wounds. They didn't try to justify the burial or the cleanup. Instead, they positioned it all as a breakdown, a mental collapse triggered by years of unresolved trauma and worsened by panic and the presence of children in the home. They also leaned into the lack of alternatives. According to the defense, Susan had nowhere to go, no resources, no protection. They presented her not as a calculated killer, but as a woman who had reached a psychological threshold and could no longer endure. But prosecutors were ready for this angle. On cross-examination, they pointed out that Susan had access to a vehicle, financial means, and support from her own family. They asked why she didn't leave, call for help, or even try to de-escalate. The psychologist's conclusions were labeled subjective, and his evaluations were challenged by experts who noted the absence of clinical diagnoses prior to the murder. In many criminal trials, psychology plays a supplementary role, but in this case, it was the centerpiece of the defense. There was no denying the act, only the motive and mental state behind it. Jurors were left to weigh two realities, one rooted in physical evidence, the other in unverified emotional testimony. The legal standard was high. Emotional strain, even when proven, does not legally justify lethal force unless it meets specific criteria of immediate danger. During closing arguments, the defense told the jury that Susan was not proud of what she did, but afraid of what might have happened if she didn't. The prosecution reminded them that Jeff Wright's body couldn't speak, but the crime scene already had. And once again, the case returned to that unavoidable question. If this had truly been self-defense, why did it end in concealment, not a call for help? On March 3, 2004, after 5.5 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Susan Lucille Wright was found guilty of murder with intent. The verdict didn't come with drama, no gas from the courtroom, no outburst from the defendant. Just the reading of a sentence that confirmed what months of forensic review, courtroom exhibits, and careful testimony had built. That the act on January 13, 2003 was not reflexive, it was deliberate. The judge sentenced Susan to 25 years in prison. The prosecution had asked for 45. The defense had pleaded for mercy. The court settled somewhere in the middle. The case was closed, but the story wasn't finished. In the years that followed, Susan's legal team filed an appeal. They argued that her trial counsel had failed her, not during the defense phase, but in how they presented mitigating factors during sentencing. In 2010, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed, citing ineffective assistance during the punishment phase. At resentencing, Susan's term was reduced from 25 to 20 years. By that time, Susan had already served 7. She had been incarcerated at the Crane Unit, a women's prison in Gatesville, Texas. She worked in the education department, kept a low profile, and completed all required counseling. Psych evaluations showed no evidence of untreated pathology, no ongoing violence risk. She applied for parole in 2014. It was denied, again in 2017. Denied. But in July 2020, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles granted conditional release. On December 30, 2020, Susan Wright was released after serving just under 16 years. Her parole terms included electronic monitoring, regular therapy, and a strict no-contact order with Jeff Wright's family. The parole board noted good behavior, completion of all institutional programs, and no violations during incarceration. She was not a danger to society, at least not anymore. Public reaction was divided. Some saw her release as overdue, an acknowledgement of a system that failed to address complex domestic situations before they exploded. Others saw it as a miscarriage of justice. Jeff's family, especially his mother and brother, never accepted the abuse narrative. To them, Susan hadn't defended herself. She had silenced a man who trusted her. During a post-release statement, Jeff's mother simply said, "A man's life ended in silence, and the woman who buried him walked free." Susan never gave a public interview. She moved to a private residence under supervision. One of her children, now an adult, chose to reunite with her. The other did not. The family that once lived behind a freshly painted fence and a row of rose bushes was gone, replaced by a permanent fracture that no court ruling could heal. The Wright case entered the curriculum of law schools and criminal psychology seminars. It's used to illustrate how domestic homicide rarely presents in clear binaries. The legal system often struggles when trauma, silence, and violence converge in one person, especially when that person survives. To the legal community, Susan Wright's conviction stood as an example of how circumstantial behavior, when combined with forensic analysis, can build a case without a single eyewitness. To victims' advocates, the case revealed gaps in recognizing signs of domestic fear. And to the public, it posed an uncomfortable question. How do you weigh a person's fear when it becomes deadly? Cases like this remind us that justice doesn't come with emotional clarity. Courts deal in facts. But real life is rarely so neat. In the end, a man lost his life, a woman lost her freedom, two children lost both parents in different ways. In January 2024, Susan's parole supervision quietly ended. She was no longer tracked. Legally, she was free. But the name Susan Wright still stirs controversy in Texas. Some remember her as the soft-spoken wife who snapped. Others remember the photos of a man stabbed 193 times and buried beneath a patio garden. Neither version tells the full story, but together they reflect something more permanent than any prison sentence: the damage done in silence. Because in cases like this, punishment may end, but the aftermath never really does. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded how fragile the line is between silence and tragedy. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that fear left unspoken can become something far more dangerous. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it buries itself in quiet routines and forced smiles until the breaking point comes. In a just society, we have to do better at hearing those silences. We have to make space for people to speak before they feel like violence is the only way out. Whether you're someone enduring fear or someone who suspects something's wrong, say something. Intervene. Ask twice. Listen closer. Because waiting until the crime scene is taped off is too late. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think this case says about justice, trauma, or second chances? Drop your thoughts in the comments, or even just share where you're watching from. If this story moved you, or even if you disagree, let's talk about it. And hey, if you found this story meaningful, or it touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. That way, you won't miss the next real-life case we bring to light. Your voice matters here. Thanks for being part of the story.